Hello and welcome back to Whiskey Uncorked. My name is Brian, and today we are doing part four of our exploration into Dalmore and bias in whiskey and how we choose to support various distilleries and what we choose to buy. Just a quick recap. Part one, an intro, kind of how we got here, sort of video. Part two was a deep dive into the types of biases that we as whiskey drinkers and just people in general can have and where those things come from and how they may impact our buying choices, as well as how we think about whiskey and how we talk about whiskey. Part three, we looked at one of the first streams of information that feeds those biases, and that is the official marketing coming from distilleries. Now, we looked at Dalmore and their webpage, and we went through and got an idea of exactly how they want us or the world really, maybe not us specifically, maybe specifically not us, but how they want the world to view them and think about them and the ways they go about achieving that. We compared that with Springbank and their webpage, because Springbank, and we chose Springbank because generally in the enthusiast community, we think of them as being the exact opposite of Dalmar in terms of the type of marketing, the type of whiskey, their ethos behind making whiskey. That's the biases and the ideas that we have about Springbank against Dalmore, which tends to be more luxury focused, more high end, lots of marketing flannel, talking about exquisite experiences and artistry and this and that, where Springbank is much more about the people, the community, the process, and those sorts of things. If you have time, you've got like almost what is it, almost 3 hours between those 3 videos. Go check those out. I'm gonna try to keep this one really short. I'm gonna share my screen again. We're gonna look at a few things, in regards to another stream of information that affects our bias, and that is all the online content that we consume from either other media outlets, aggregations of reviews, or specifically, like, YouTube reviews and that sort of thing. Just real quick, I'm gonna get into that right now, so this video doesn't drag on too long. So I'm going to bring up my screen again. And the first thing I'm going to look at is Whiskey Base. If you don't know what Whiskey Base is, it is a site where you can go and create an account and you can review whiskeys. You can either just put a score, you can rate like the nose, palate, and finish. You can leave more detailed written reviews. And basically, this site will kind of aggregate those things. And as you can see, I've clicked on Dalmore as a brand, and it's going to list out their core range, their other distillery bottlings, and independent bottlings. And you can kind of take a quick look at this and you can click into each of these and get some more specific information. I'm not going to spend any time doing that today because, like I said, I want to keep this one a little bit shorter. One word of advice, just because it has a score here and a rating, that doesn't necessarily take into account exactly how many people have scored it. Sometimes you can click on these and they only have like 1 or 2 votes. And obviously that's going to make that score a little less relevant overall. I am actually drinking Dalmore. This is the Hart Brothers Independent Bottling. Definitely tune in for part five, which will be the last part of this. And I have some opinions on this one, but I am actually drinking Dalmore today. All right. So what are we seeing here? Well, at the top, we have an average rating of 85.48, and that is 707 total votes over all these different whiskeys. Now, you see there's a lot of them that will be listed out here. So, obviously, some of these, particularly in the core range, will have quite a few votes. And a lot of the more obscure bottlings and independent bottlings may only have a few. So, generally speaking, this is kind of how I look at Whiskey Base. And again, it depends on how many people have rated a whiskey. But once a whiskey hits 90, or above, you're probably talking about a really good whiskey, especially if it has like more than 10, 15 reviews. You're talking about something that's generally thought of as being really, really good. Generally, you don't see too much fall below 80. So that kind of 80 to 90 range is where a lot of stuff ends up falling, just generally speaking. At least that's my experience with whiskey base. So 85 out of, 85.5 essentially overall is actually pretty solid. That's if you're talking about biases and the biases that I came into all of this with, and you would have asked me, well, what's the Dalmore's overarching score? I probably would have had it low 80s. But there's some caveats to this. But 85.5 is actually pretty solid. You can see right next to it, it says highest rated whiskeys. You get some absolutely epic drams. So you can see there are some very highly rated whiskeys up here. If you're getting 95 on Whiskey Base with more than a dozen reviews, generally speaking, you're getting something that's going to be very, very, very good. But if we look below this, we see the core range. And now most of these so these are going to be more contemporary bottlings. You can kind of see the smaller little icons here for the whiskey. These are the more recent bottlings. If there are versions of this that have kind of been discontinued, they end up falling under this distillery bottling. But you can see that we are generally talking about capping out around 85, um, but nothing below 70. Now, again, 12-year old is going to be the most popular one here. Over 1,000 votes for this, and it's one of the more uh, one of the more low scores that we're seeing, at least right here with the core range, which isn't surprising. But 80 is starting to push it in terms of quality drams. But we're going to look at something that might indicate that there is possibly some bias here. But it's a little bit less biased because you do have over 1,000 people voting. But generally speaking, right, we saw that 85.48 average score. This is pretty close to that, right? Maybe a little less. They stop at the 18-year-old in terms of as a core range. The 21-year-old you can argue is core range, but and then some of the other ones may be more of an annual release. But yeah, I still think I was surprised at how good of scores these got, especially considering for how many people have voted on them. Because if you get 1,000 people voting, some people are going to give it a good score. Some people are going to give it a really bad score. Some people are going to give scores to counteract other scores, right? It happens a lot and other kind of crowdsourced rating sites like Metacritic and things like that for media, games, movies, TV shows. People either give things a 10 out of 10 or a 0 out of 0. It's neither of those things. It's somewhere in between. But people don't bring nuance to those sites. And I'm sure to some degree that's probably happening here. But still, I think I was generally surprised by this. 80, I expected more scores to be around 80, given the things that I've heard. Mostly that maybe I was incorrect about that, and I was biased to even what I had heard, what I thought I had heard a little bit later. Again, distillery bottlings, these are either discontinued, annual releases, special releases. You're going to get stuff you can't buy here, right? These are old bottles. You see all the different 12 years that they've had over the years. Some of these are getting pretty good scores. Um, I think it was up until 2002. That's all they had was the 12-year. Then they started expanding out their core in terms of core range. And then they started expanding that out in the early 2000s to eventually what we have today. And then you start seeing some of these super old vintages, super high age statements, and you're getting those scores that are in well into the 90s. So, and then they start listing out all the independent bottlings. See, there's a ton things listed out here, but they can list. Let me make this screen slightly smaller so I can scroll through these, but you'll see not every independent bottling that's ever been out there, but like somebody has to come make a profile for that whiskey, leave a review, leave a score, that sort of thing. But you can find Adelphi, AD Rattray, which generally seems to have a pretty good track record, but these are older bottlings, right? This is bottle 2021, but it's from 2023, so it's not, 18 years old or something like that. And it got an 86. But with a lot of these, you're not going to get a ton of votes because these are independent bottlings. There may only been 100, 200, 251 bottles in this case. How many of those people that bought this are on whiskey base? Not that many. So we have 8 votes, resulting in an 86. But yeah, the point being, you can go through and you can get kind of an idea of what we're talking about in terms of the general consensus with Dalmore as a whole. Obviously, we saw at the top just over 85 in terms of an average score, which is solid. There are these really old bottlings, whether they're independent or official, getting great scores, probably propping that up to some degree, right? Like you look at Caden Heads, there's a ton of old vintages. And these are all getting definitely above 85 into the 90s. You're getting a couple duds, but again, these are probably don't have a ton of actual votes. One vote on this bottle, that one doesn't really count. It's not going to affect the overall average all that much. But what did I take away from this page? I was surprised. But then I thought, like, well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised. How many times have I actually looked at whiskey base in this way? And I said, okay, let me bring up a distillery that is generally viewed very positively amongst the modern day whiskey enthusiast community, but one that has some older bottlings, not super old like Dalmore does. It's well respected. It's been around for a while. They've had a lot of opportunities for releasing whiskeys in the 20-plus-year-old, and they have a lot of non-age statement whiskeys. They have age stated whiskeys. Anyways, I chose Aaron, having no idea the Isle of Arran distillery. I did not have an idea of what I was going to find. It was the first one I typed in, and it basically did exactly as I hoped. So let's look at them. Average rating 85.64. Dalmore 85.48. Almost identical. Now, Aaron does have like 2.5 times as many votes, which shows that yes, the people that are using whiskey base are more likely to be drinking Aaron and talking about Aaron and going on a site like this and leaving a review, whether it's for their own records or to participate in the larger community. And again, you can see their highest rated whiskeys are not as high as Dalmore's, but they're not as old either, right? So maybe that's fair enough. With the highest rated being this 1996. This is the Stillman's Dram. This is a series that I don't know. I've seen this name thrown around a few times. I don't know if it's specific to independent bottler or if this is just a name that the Stillman's Dram is used across distilleries. Because I know there are Dalmore releases of the Stillman's Dram, but anyways, this one's 27 years old, so a lot of age on it. We got only 4 votes though, so not a lot of this floating around with 258 total bottlings. But yeah, you can look at the core range scores here, and you see these are generally higher than the Dalmore's core range. But these are 46%, non-show filtered, natural color, but they're not that much higher. There's a couple here that stand the 18-year-old, super well respected, a very good bottle. It's up to $200 here in the US plus tax. It's still less than the Glendronach 18 we looked at yesterday, which was 220 plus tax, I believe. So still Still, generally speaking, a good value, but yeah, 18-year-old whiskeys are becoming very expensive. And then all of their special releases, a lot of the older pre-branding releases are listed here as well. But you can see a very long list of all of these like single casts and special releases. And yeah, I have not seen many independent bottlings of Aaron. At least not coming in here in the US. You can see this is an individual cask bottling. I'm assuming these are like private casks or people bought casks of Aaron. I'm assuming what that means. But yeah, there are not a lot of independent bottlings. These seem to be like certainly not that reach the US. And I haven't seen too many people talk about them, but I'd love to try some. Anyways, but I was surprised. This is almost like the exact same score on average that the Dalmore had, albeit, um, sorry, a lot more votes. You can take a little bit more faith in that because there's more votes. But also, like, we know that people are going to be probably coming at Aaron with a little bit more positive outlook. There's more positive bias, particularly on a site like Whiskey Base, where people are online and they're kind of participating in this large community. You can also argue that the Dalmar is being propped up by some of their super old vintages, super old age statements, but it's still pretty close, which was surprising to me. All right, let's look at the next source of scores. So I mentioned Whiskey Fun before. It's a great resource. It's mostly one guy, Serge Valentine, Angus McRailed. As you can see, he's also a guest taster. He does whiskey sponge stuff, I believe he's involved in, and probably a number of other things, but a well respected palate in the industry as well. But if you come here on the side, you can see there's a list of pretty much all the Scottish distilleries. You click on one and you come to a page like this. Gives you some basic information on the distillery. One of the more highly rated, again, right? Someone basically linked to this post on Whiskey Base as far as a score, which is interesting. But 96 points on Whiskey Fun is an extremely good score. I know, like some of the more some people credit Surge with putting Brora back on the map with some of these old releases. You're talking like 97. I'm assuming he's given a 98. I don't know exactly what the peak is, but I know he has given out 97s, but 96 is basically like legendary status. So we can't as easily look at all the different scores that he's given out over the years, but you can see the collection of whiskeys he's tasted and rated, or that they have, assuming that maybe some of these are from Angus. But if we take a quick look, we click on, so usually does more than one at a time. Back in 2018, he gave the 12-year-old 40% official bottling, an 84. That's a pretty solid score. He says right here, it's a great whiskey. He does talk about their hyperbolic marketing, but overall, he does feel that this, even at 40%, is a quote, great whiskey. The Portwood Reserve, not so much. Gave this one a 77. He said he'd take one bottle of the 12 over a case of the Portwood at any time, even with the Portwood being 46.5%. It is what it is. That is his opinion, but generally favorable, but particularly for the 12 year. All right, let's look at another more recent one. This is March 2023. He talked about the 15-year-old, which he gave an 87. We'll talk about this again as an older review, but Ralphie, another well respected voice who's been around whiskey forever, but probably more critical than Surge is going to be based on ABV, chill filtration, coloring, that sort of thing. I believe he gave this an 84, which I would generally, yeah, it's a matter of opinion. I'll let you decide as to whether that's on his old scale too. So probably new scale, that's more like an 80 or maybe even a 79. So he says it's kind of like a 4 to 5 point difference, I think. He rated the King Alexander III, which is an expensive bottle of whiskey, non age statement. Gave this one an 80, so not great. Although he does note that earlier batches have been better. There's obviously this, or then they have this Madeira finish, 46%. Gave this one an 83. So again, not even that great of a score. Like the 12-year-old official bottling or the regular release, 40%. And this was around the same time, 2018, around there that this was actually released. Although that was a few years difference in terms of when he scored them. This actually got a point lower than the 12. All right. But what are we seeing so far? Fairly consistent reviews. And they're generally speaking positive. Like maybe not like through the roof. Yes, some of the super old age statements or super old vintages, yes, those are getting epic scores. But it's not just this disdain that like my bias kind of felt like was going to be out there when I started looking into this stuff. But there's some other media outlets, right? We have Whiskey Advocate, some of these more traditional magazines or focused on whiskey, cigars, wine, a little bit more mass market. Their scores do, at least in my opinion, tend to lean higher, right? They're more willing to give out high scores, which is fine if you understand that and you get a feeling for um, where whiskeys kind of fall, right? But you're not going to see a lot of super low scores for them from them. And we can see this is that 50-year-old Dalmore, which is apparently absolutely epic. The highest rated Dalmore, at least based on the search where I picked single malt Scotch and Dalmore. Yeah, pretty much going to be the same thing, right? And you can see when they did the review, this 25-year-old, $2,500. Good score though. And you see some of their very special releases, right? That's Stillman's Dram, that 28-year-old that we looked at earlier. Very good score from them here as well. Old vintages, old vintages. We keep scrolling down though. What do we find? 12-year-old Sherry Cask Select, which is the bottle that I chose to buy for this series as an official bottling. And generally, the opinion on this bottle is pretty positive. There's at least one other channel that said that this is probably the one to buy. I don't have enough experience to say, but again, check back in part 5 for my final decision on exactly how good this 12-year-old Cherry Cask Select is. But it generally is pretty well respected. And I did not pay $80 for it. I paid, even with tax, probably about 70, maybe slightly more. So this would probably be approaching 85, $90 once you add the sales tax. So generally speaking, if you're going to buy a Dalmore 12 or a Dalmore at all, maybe spend a few extra bucks for this if you can swing it. But we see some of the other standard releases. King Alexander III Cigar Malt Reserve. It's a 21-year-old from 2015. So you have to keep track of the dates. But again, pretty positive. Although you do see some scores start getting kind of low for some old vintages, even. I was kind of surprised by that they do have some special releases and old 30-year-old 85, which I don't know what Whiskey Advocate would say is in terms of how good of a score that is, but I generally think like that's certainly not a $6,400 bottle. But I digress. So interesting. Again, generally positive, although not taking value into account, obviously. Whiskey Magazine, another one. Real quick. Just go through here, quick scroll, quick average. To me, looks like even with all the different age statements and things maybe propping it up, we're looking at 8 out of 10 average. Pretty solid. It's not being viewed as swill. And even some of the independent bottlings are some of the more lowly or lower scored whiskeys out of the whole group. I'm sure if you want to make that into a bit of a conspiracy theory, feel free, but I'm just going to take it at face value for right now. All right. So let me switch back to here. But yeah, I was surprised. I was surprised at that there was actually a relatively positive view on the quality of the Dalmore's whiskey. And yeah, some of it's propped up by old age statements and old vintages, but it's not like just scores in the toilet, right? That surprised me. I thought it would be worse. And that shows what my bias was, right? Like somehow I got this idea that not only was Dalmore whiskey overpriced, but it wasn't really even that good. And remember, a lot of those scores, particularly like on the whiskey based site, these are regular people who are bringing their biases. You can argue that Serge, obviously, he has his biases at Whiskey Fun, but he has tasted thousands of whiskeys over the years. And if you read his reviews, yes, he points out this is expensive, this has bad marketing, but he's not afraid to give a 40% ABV chill filtered E150A filled whiskey a good score if it's good whiskey, which I really, really admire because that is ultimately what I want my channel to at least aspire to be, even though reviews are not necessarily my thing at the moment. I think that's what you should do. He doesn't bring price into the equation. He just says this is good whiskey, it's bad whiskey, and you can decide whether you're going to shell out the cash for some of those absurd bottlings. Yeah, I think that's the way it should be. But not everyone agrees, and that's cool too. Although I do appreciate even if in his he does this I think occasionally. Like he'll say like, "Hey, the price on this is a little bit crazy." In other words, it's not a great value. I do appreciate like, do you think it's a good value or not? The opinion is good if you state that. Just don't know if it should affect the score. But obviously, I felt misled. Like, well, what where else have I gotten opinions on? And the obvious answer is YouTube reviews, that sort of thing. So I checked out a couple channels, mostly ones that I'm familiar with. There were channels that came up that I didn't know of before, smaller channels. I'll have to take some time at some point and check those out. But for the purpose of this, I stuck with channels that may have actually realistically influenced my bias. So, just real quick, first one, it's a very fairly recent review. G Whiskey, about 4 months ago, he talked about the Portwood Reserve, which is the 46.5 version that Surge did not like. But I think that was from a few years ago. That one. And he generally talked positively about it. You know, he doesn't hate Dalmore, but he understands why some people have negative opinions of them as a whole. Kind of talked about some of the negative stereotypes. Said that he enjoys the cigar malt, but it's just too expensive. He mentioned the Sherry Cask Select again, that special 12-year, 43%, referred to it as beautiful whiskey, and that this Portwood he gave some pretty complex notes. He said it was pretty good, but the Sherry Cask Select is better at a lower ABV, and eventually gave it an 86 out of 100, which is, again, pretty good score. So I looked at some older reviews and I saw like No Nonsense Whiskey about 6 years ago. He talked about the 12, pretty quick, short, to the point review, talked about it being complex. He said he would buy it again. And it was his first experience with the Dalmore. He did eventually review the Luceo, which was also around that, 6 years ago. Didn't watch that one yet, at least. But yeah, it was positive. But this was 6 years ago. This is like whiskey was certainly ramping up pre-pandemic. The pandemic is when things like went crazy, right? and it's when Whiskey Tube went crazy, and I don't know, I think at that point, a lot of things changed in terms of people's opinions about whiskey, and I looked, and it didn't look like he's done a standalone review of Dalmore since then. I'd be curious to know what he thinks. But then I looked at Ralphie. I've watched a lot of Ralphie over the years, obviously, as a Scotch drinker. Definitely had an impact on my formative Scotch years. At this point, I have a lot of my own opinions. So regardless of the channel, like I don't always agree as I have my own experience to base some of my things on, but that's cool. That's the way it should be. He did a 15-year-old review 6 years ago. He reviewed this 15-year-old, 40%. He gave it an 84 out of 100. And like again, this was on his old system. I think I mentioned this. So maybe more closer to 80 now, maybe even less. Generally, not super positive review. He did mention that it was pleasant and that it would be good for the occasional Scotch drinker. Thinly delivered, the chill filtration has stripped it of its character, that sort of thing, which not surprising. Pretty consistent messaging from Ralphie. He did say that he thought there were good casts and good whiskey in it. They just kind of stripped it of its character and diluted it. 3 years later, so 3 years ago, at least according to YouTube, he reviewed the 18-year-old, which I thought he talked about more positively overall, but he gave it an 83 out of 100. And he talked about how it was quote unquote cosmetic whiskey, but he did mention that this has been designed and engineered. Dalmore is making exactly what they intend on making, which is true. And they're very successful doing that. They've sold a lot of whiskey doing that. And that can be frustrating, but you can't knock them for making exactly what they intend to make. You can knock the principle of the thing, or you can knock the people that are buying it, but they're not making a mistake. They're doing exactly what they intend to. Finally, let's talk about Whiskey Vault. I thought this was interesting. Whiskey Vault, very the reason I'm here today, right? Their videos with the Modern Rogue took a fledgling whiskey interest and just set that thing in overdrive. And here we are 5 years later, surrounded by whiskey with an actual YouTube channel of my own. 6 years ago, earlier on in their adventures, it's fun to take that trip down memory lane, especially given some of the recent changes over there. And I haven't watched that. I don't watch them a ton anymore. I haven't for a while. Right. Sometimes you just kind of outgrow some of some content. I think that's happened with multiple channels over the years. And you just look for something a little bit different. But 6 years ago, they talked about the Dalmore 12 year, and they were very complimentary of it, both the 12-year and the King Alexander III. You have to remember they take a very anti snobbery stance, which I think was even stronger back then. The best whiskey is the whiskey you like to drink the way you like to drink it. And they had this approach of basically, like, if you're nitpicking this or nitpicking that, that's being snobby. And they said, and I think it was Daniel in regards to E150A, he said, "Who cares about the E150A?" He said, "Even if it does change the flavor, it makes it taste amazing because this is delicious." Or that Dalmore in general is delicious, I think it was. And they talked about some tasty notes, and Rexeve was even comparing it to Monkey Shoulder, which I know Monkey Shoulder is a lot different today than it was back then. I did have a bottle back then. I didn't taste. That was before I started keeping samples of my bottles. Otherwise, I might have busted that thing out and tried it. But definitely not a comparison I would have thought to make. But anyways, that was a long time ago, and that was kind of back in like the Mooch and Somm days. And I think Rex was learning a lot about whiskey at that time. Fast forward to about a month ago, right before the format changed, and Rex, one of the last videos that they did together on the Whiskey Vault, they reviewed, or they're not really reviews, and they know that, but the cigar malt, it was $180, and generally speaking, they were still really positive about it, but you can tell like that they had at least evolved a little bit, right? They said, I think even Rex was like, I would really prefer a few extra points of proof, and he'd rather it not be colored, but it wasn't quite as flippant about that sort of attitude. Um, Acknowledging that this is still really good, and if only they do things a little bit differently, basically. They didn't really talk about value at 180 bucks, $200 out the door. Yeah, you probably want a little bit more from your experience, but all of those mostly positive, even in Ralphie's criticisms, acknowledging what it is, and who it's for and where its place is. So, yeah, it was a little bit of a humble check. I know a lot of my biases came in passing, right? You're watching more long form content, you're listening to podcasts, live streams, and people just say things kind of in the process of talking about a larger topic. And there's a good chance that those things are what really influenced me into believing the things that I believed about Dalmore prior to this exercise. But it was interesting to go take a look and see, like, what do people actually say? Like, it's not that negative, and a lot of it comes down to price. But Dalmore has priced their whiskeys very deliberately for a very specific reason, and those prices aren't coming down. If anything, they keep going up, so they clearly don't regret the decisions that they've made prior. This is gonna be an interesting next couple of days as I piece all this together into this final video, which is supposed to be more condensed because this is part 5 is supposed to be like an ongoing series for all these different distilleries. They're gonna be one episode, try to keep it under an hour, like an exploration of these lesser known distilleries, not this 5 part behemoth. But I have to kind of come to some conclusions here about, at least in the near term, how I'm going to think and feel and talk about a distillery like Dalmore. And I'm still not sure, because where does it fall in the grand scheme of the whiskey universe? Is it irrelevant? If it's not, how much does it matter? How much do I care? What place does it have on my channel or anyone's channel? Tough questions for me to answer right now, but I took my biases that I believed. I went and I actually looked at what was out there, and although it wasn't the exact opposite, I wasn't just horribly incorrect, right? There's not a lot of people screaming from the rooftops about how good the Dalmore whiskey is. There's no one out there saying every bottle in their lineup is worth the money because it's so good. Yeah, that's not happening. But most people, if who sat down with a glass of it, say, at the very least, this isn't bad. It's pretty good. They have some critiques, they have some criticisms, they wish it was a little bit different, but no one's spitting it out onto the floor saying, "How can you charge what for this?" But yeah, challenge your biases. Man, it's so easy just to hear a few things or one or two channels or some comments in passing just say something about a bottle or a distillery or a style or whatever, and it just stick in there. And if you go out and look and you're like, yeah, you know what, there was some truth to that, but it wasn't the whole story. There's a lot of people out there that say, even channels that I've watched over the years and outlets and things that I've respected, they don't think this is bad. And yeah, if you're not once you start adding that value proposition into it, it gets tough, but it doesn't mean the whiskey's bad. Could it be better? Yes. And again, I'll give my opinions on that next episode because, yeah, it could be better and it could be cheaper, but there's reasons why it's not. All right. Thank you for indulging me once again. We're going to keep this around 45 minutes, which is better than an hour and a half. I'll take it. Part five, last part of this, we're going to talk about the actual bottles of whiskey. We're going to touch on a couple things in terms of a brief overview of the history of Dalmore, specifically like in the last 20 years, 25 years. Why is Dalmore the way it is? What are, in just a quick summary of what are they trying to be? The original video I tried to make before I had to do this absurd month-long thing. Um, but yeah, leave a comment, like, subscribe. I really appreciate it. If you've watched these ridiculous videos, and bravo, I really appreciate it. I'm not going to make these videos all the time. I can't wait to get back to making like reasonable videos. I don't know if I'll ever be a 5-minute review type channel, but we'll see. But one more video, stick with me, and it'll be fun trying to kind of come to a conclusion of this because I've been surprised at almost every turn. Expectations have been shattered, both positively, negatively. It's been an adventure. But until part five, cheers, have a good one, and take care.